Good morning and good evening to all of you. I'm Rob Skinner with the United Nations, and welcome to the panel on innovative partnerships in a time of crisis, hosted by the Goal 17 partners. It's my pleasure to be with you this afternoon. It's afternoon in New York anyway. We have an amazing group of panelists who are going to talk about that incredibly timely subject. We certainly are in a time of crisis around the world as we take on the COVID-19 pandemic. And we certainly need to have innovative partnerships as we move through this. At the United Nations, we've been thinking about innovative partnerships, for many years, of course, but particularly since the Sustainable Development Goals were created and announced in 2015, and thinking about Goal 17, which is where the name of this partnership comes from, on partnerships, in thinking about how to put them together to achieve the SDGs. Of course, at the United Nations and with every organization around the world, whether it be private sector, civil society, NGOs, individuals, have all had to change their thinking dramatically and come up with dynamic thinking to look at partnership through the lens of tackling this COVID-19 pandemic. And I think as we talk about and work through the panel today, there'll be a lot of conversation around how we take on that initial phase, the health crisis, for which the World Health Organization is working closely with I believe, probably many of you on this call, as they've had relationships with many private sector umbrella organizations as well as individual entities, as they've looked at how they can best take on the health crisis. Then, of course, as Secretary Guterres has talked about, we are going to have to manage the socioeconomic crises that will come with this, the fallout that we're seeing happening in places around the world already, and we'll certainly see more of, and we recognize that. And again, dynamic, creative, innovative partnerships are going to be necessary to help us work through that phase. And then as the UN has been looking at it, looking through to the recovery and talking about recovering better, building back better, and using the Sustainable Development Goals as a framework to do that. I mean, we're fortunate that we have that framework that was established in 2015 to come out of this crisis. And if we can look to that, work together, partner together across all sectors, I think we will have a better way of moving forward. But of course, first, we have to take on the health crisis, and that's critical. I mean, with the suffering that we're seeing around the world, we need everyone to come together around that, particularly in the stages where we're seeing the virus moving at the moment into the developing world, into societies that have less resilience and less capabilities. And we have to think about how we're going to deal with the most vulnerable societies and communities that are going to need the support of the international community and the partners, many of whom, again, in this meeting, in this panel, to come together and be supportive and stay together, working in solidarity. That's a word we're hearing a lot around the UN right now, and that solidarity at the global level, at community level, and across sectors. I think it's going to be critical. And I can think of no better group to be hosting a conversation on this than Goal 17 partners. I've had the pleasure of working with this group over several years as it's come together and really attempted and pushed hard and has actually succeeded in pulling together a community from the private sector, working across sectors to take on the biggest challenges. And we certainly have an enormous challenge in front of us right now. So with that, again, thank you all for joining us. It's a pleasure to be here. We have an amazing conversation to look forward to ahead of you. And with that, I'd like to throw it over to my good friend and partner, J.R. Kerr of Handshake and Goal 17 Partners. J.R.
Thanks, Rob. I appreciate that. We're glad to have you on the line. And again, incredibly grateful for the partnership that we've had with UN Officer Partnerships over the years. So I'm J.R. Kerr, Executive Director of Goal 17 Partners, and excited to bring to you the fourth in what has been a series of roundtable discussions over the course of this week, focusing on issues of sustainability, equality, and accessibility at a time of real crisis. And so what we've done at Goal 17 Partners, which is a non-for-profit that essentially brings the private to private sector partnerships to the SDGs, is we've pivoted the platform in the short term to address this immediate healthcare crisis and ensuing economic fallout. But we've done so in a way that keeps our eye on the long term and does so looking to deliver essentially the 3 C's, the capabilities, the coalitions, and ultimately the courage that the private sector is going to need on the other side of this to keep important work moving forward. Today, we're talking about sort of the heart of Goal 17, which is partnerships. And you've got a remarkable panel. So I want to get to them straight away. I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves by name, title, and organization pretty quickly so that we can then get straight to the first round of questions. So if I could throw to Asha first, please.
Great, thank you so much, JR. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to Goal 17 for this opportunity to discuss innovative partnerships during what seems to be unprecedented times in our lifetime. So Asha Varghese, I have the privilege of leading the Caterpillar Foundation, which is the nonprofit arm of the Caterpillar company. Interestingly enough, today Caterpillar is celebrating its 95th year. So we're excited to be part of this journey, and in alignment with the mission of the company, the foundation is focused on building resilient communities where we live and work, and in areas where most in need around the world. Innovative partnerships is a core of who we are and how we implement programs. So looking forward to this conversation.
Great, thanks, Asha. Michael from Guggenheim, could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, good morning from Santa Monica, California. I'm Michael Perkinson. I'm the Chief of Staff at Guggenheim Partners. We're an asset management firm headquartered here in the US and with offices all over the world. We were, I think, with JR and Susan, the creators of Goal 17 Partners. We originally conceived of it as a safe harbor for the private sector to talk about sustainability, but I think with this crisis, the private sector doesn't need a safe harbor anymore, because I think the private sector in a lot of ways is leading the effort, whether it's our friends at Pfizer, who are working to develop a vaccine, or those in the fashion industry who are dedicating their seamstresses to creating masks. So I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks, JR.
Thanks, Michael. Appreciate it. And Michael and Guggenheim were absolutely the driving force behind Goal 17 and have been. So thank you, Michael, very much. Tom Murray.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tom Murray, joining you from Washington, D.C. today. I'm the Vice President of EDF+Business at Environmental Defense Fund. Environmental Defense Fund is a leading global advocacy group, and we combine science, policy, and unusual partnerships to try to tackle the biggest environmental challenges. Happy to be here.
Great, thanks, Tom. Sue?
Hi, yeah. Thanks very much for inviting me. It's fantastic to be here. I'm Sue Allchurch. I'm the Chief of Outreach and Engagement at the UN Global Compact. That is, for anyone who doesn't know, it's the United Nations Corporate Sustainability Initiative. We're 20 years old today, and our whole role is to work with businesses to help deliver sustainable development goals.
That's great. Thanks, Sue. Neil?
Hello, everybody. Neil Gregory from the International Finance Corporation, where I lead our thought leadership work. And the International Finance Corporation is the private sector arm for World Bank Group. So we lend long-term debt and invest equity in firms in emerging markets to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and climate change goals.
That's great. Thanks, Neil. And last but certainly not least, Peter, if you could introduce yourself, we're glad to have you.
Yeah, hi, Peter Sands. I'm the Executive Director of the Global Fund to Fight AIDS/TB Malaria, which is, I suppose, the iconic public-private unusual partnership that was created to fight the last pandemic, which HIV. And we are very, very active. As of today, I think we have provided support to 60 countries on COVID-19. It sort of goes up by a country or two a day. Yeah, it is a time where we need a lot of partnerships.
That's great. Thanks, Peter. And actually, Peter, the first question is going to go to you. You're absolutely right. I mean, the Global Fund is one of the most iconic partnership models out there to address what has been, in the last 20 years, one of the greatest healthcare crises that we've faced in the world to date. Now we face another one. And so I guess my first question would be, what have you learned about partnerships from this last decade? And what do you think we'll need moving forward from those lessons as the private and public sector work together to face the COVID crisis?
It seems it's probably not the answer you want, but actually good partnerships take time and trust and personal leadership to create. And we don't have time. And where we have new people interacting with each other, you have to take a lot on trust. But we do need the personal leadership. And we are seeing companies, we have many private sector partners already. They are stepping up. And we are seeing companies who haven't really been involved with us before beginning to. But it's, I have a slightly, I still don't think we quite get the nature of what needs to be done. I have been quite critical, and I come from the private sector. I used to be a CEO of a bank, right? So I've sat on that side of it. I still don't think that it took a hell of a lot of time, in my mind, for people to really get the scale of what needed to be done, and the fact that it wasn't just the sum of a lot of small actions, but we actually needed a collective mobilization. And I think you are now seeing that in some sectors and with some companies taking great leadership. But I have to say, as somebody who was trying to get people I knew at CEO level in industry to do things early in February, it was really hard to get people to move and to understand quite what was happening.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, I think, you know, I think the statement you made about personal leadership is something that we at Goal 17 talk a lot about. You know, I think we talk a lot about the courageous leader inside of companies and inside of organizations stepping up in moments like this. Asha, for the Caterpillar Foundation, I think you guys have shown a lot of courageous leadership. Historically, you've certainly done that here on the anniversary, 95th anniversary of your company, filled with a lot of courageous leaders. But the foundation in particular has taken a really strong leadership position, especially in this COVID crisis. Could you speak to what you're doing as a company and sort of what kind of partnerships you think will be needed to address this crisis and beyond?
Sure. Thanks for that, Jared. I think one of the things that the foundation's been focused on, which aligns with the mission of who we are as a company, is building strong and resilient communities. So, and it resonates even more during the time of the crisis, where we really need to band together and look across our sectors and partnerships to see what we're really good at, and have that coordinated effort, as Pete said, that collective leadership is absolutely necessary to ensure that we're leveraging our resources effectively. Our journey started in December in China, where when we started seeing sort of the rumblings of this, truly it was a long-term partnership that we had with a local partner that raised the issue, and for us to be able to respond fairly quickly. The ability for us to be able to do that was because of that long-term partnership as part of our Together Stronger platform, to really work with them and to trust them to be able to deploy funds very quickly to support some of the hospital systems in the Hubei province. So did not anticipate what was coming down the pike. Given that my background in global health, I did definitely see a lot of noise being made in that space, and knew that, you know, I think a lot of us are still coming out of the Ebola timeframe to now this. But at Caterpillar Foundation, we've really been looking inward into a lot of our partnerships to say, from a global perspective, how do we really make an impact? So our partnership with the UN Foundation, WHO Solidarity Fund, was absolutely critical to be able to provide that scale that we wouldn't otherwise as a company. And I'm one person to definitely stand on this platform that we can't solve this alone. We have to really come together and start building some of these innovative partnerships. But in the time of crisis, time is of the essence, and that's when, you know, you really start to see some of these innovations come to fruition. So we really had to take a broad perspective and looking to see how we can respond quickly to some of the hard hit places, such as Italy, where in partnerships with King Bedouin, looking at, hospital systems again. One of the innovations that I really want to highlight is internally, we looked at our facilities and the communities where our facilities, because you're talking about multiple employees and their families, and we really let them also help us build up some of these local partnerships and innovations, whether it's working with a nonprofit in Houston that is using 3D technology to print PPEs, and a very similar approach being taken all the way out in Brazil. So really being able to bring together our 50+ communities across the globe to be able to innovate and start looking at some of those partnerships. So those are the ways in which we've been looking at responding to some of these crisis requirements. In addition to that, we've looked at basic human needs. I think all of us here can talk to sort of the support that we're providing to the food banks, not just in the Americas, but also on the global front. But really bringing this as an opportunity for us to see how can we band together, because I think we're probably going into this, this is initially a healthcare crisis, but it is an economic crisis as well. So how do we leverage each other's funds effectively and start building some of those partnerships to be able to stretch our dollars further, but also bring our innovations together. So that's what we've been focused on at the Caterpillar Foundations, in being able to build stronger, resilient communities.
That's great. Thanks, Asha. That's a great point. It's a great point that we should start with long-standing partners. I think it gets to Peter's point. Trust and time are the things that make great partnerships. So starting with long-standing partners and then using that as a way to new partners to address the new crisis, I think is a really smart way to go. Tom, we've heard from a lot of folks focused on the environment that when a crisis like this comes up, an issue of healthcare, that in a way it actually distracts from what your core purpose is. Obviously, you're focused on more than just the environment, but at EDF, I'm curious to hear, how are you guys engaging your partners? How are you pivoting your work? And what are some of the ways you're thinking about bringing your ecosystem to this issue and then beyond?
Thanks, JR. For us, we haven't really seen a distraction. I think it's been more of a reframing. For a long time, I think we've known, and folks on this call have known, that a thriving global economy depends on a thriving environment. And this crisis has also brought into sharp relief that it also depends on thriving people and thriving communities. One of the partnerships we've had over the last couple of years is with Google and cities around the world, cities like Houston that Asha mentioned, Oakland, London, where we've used new lower cost air quality monitors to do hyperlocal mapping of air pollution in cities. And certainly as we're seeing this crisis unfold, we are increasingly concerned about the connections between COVID-19 and people with underlying respiratory illnesses and connections to parts of the world with high air pollution. I heard Peter's point about pace, but I've certainly been inspired, JR, about courageous leadership that you've referred to from lots of corners of the economy, and many of our partners, certainly first and foremost, first responders and healthcare workers, but also the retail workers. We do a lot of work with major retailers in the US on sustainability. The retail workers have shown themselves as essential frontline workers. And the US state and local governments, unfortunately, mostly state and local are the ones that have really stepped up. And we're seeing our private sector partners do that in a big way. The reason for it is a bigger challenge that we need to come back on the other side of this crisis, right? Which is that the social contract between government, business, and society, even before this global health crisis, had been stretched to its limits. We've been trying to use that to our advantage in our work with businesses, because we think the expectations for how business shows up in the world is now higher than ever by certain stakeholders, investors, employees, customers. and that the businesses that have long-term success are going to be the ones who are rethinking, reimagining their business models in ways that help them compete in a global economy, but also help them build a future that is more sustainable, more equitable, and more resilient. And that's the work that I lead. You know, our corporate engagement team is all about working with leading businesses, high impact businesses, energy, food and ag, transportation, manufacturing, retail, to rethink their business models and their supply chains in ways that help us stabilize the climate, accelerate the shift to a more resilient and sustainable food production system, clean up our oceans, improve public health outcomes. We do this through partnerships, some one-on-one, some more collaborative, but they're really all focused on raising ambition, picking up the pace with higher ambition and pace. We spend a lot of time focusing on execution, really how do you get it done? Holding companies accountable for results, and then sharing what we learn so that we can create a domino effect and have ripples across industries and sectors.
That's great, thank you. That's really, really well said. Sue, the Global Compact, you guys obviously sit, and I think Tom rightly brought up the tension, that was really well said, that the social contract between governments and people in a way had been quite stretched, I think, coming into this season. And you all sit between governments and the private sector, and in fact, really help build those partnerships. I'm curious, number one, what do you think is going to be necessary to respond to this immediate crisis? And how can we do that in a way that we ready ourselves for what's to come after? And how are you guys doing this at the UN Global Compact?
Yeah. It's a good question. And I mean, I actually draw on what Rob said right at the beginning, which is really the focus of the work that we're doing. Very much as well, what Tom was saying is, the Global Compact's focus is to work with businesses to help them shape their business, support them in their strategies and operations so that we deliver the goals. So simply said, that's what we do. And with COVID, we don't take our eye off the ball. And I think that's the number one message, that we need to make sure that collectively, with partnerships, with government, with UN partners, with private sector, we keep our eyes on the prize of the Sustainable Development Goals, because in the end, a lot of what we're seeing is just making that harder, but no less relevant. So our role right now together is to make sure that we focus not just on keeping our eyes on Agenda 2030, we have to deliver those goals, but to try and come out of this and recover in better shape so that we can go faster across all the key goals. And we're in a great position because we can actually see and work together how governments, how the UN, and how businesses working together. But I'll try and sort of illustrate that a little bit. If you think of the world we're in now, and that we're going to be in whatever, 6 months, a year's time, or whatever, is going to be different, a lot different, but the goals are the same. Inequalities in and between societies are going to grow. So sustainable finance, ever more important. Blended finance between private and public funding, ever more important. Humanitarian assistance to 100 million people still in need, ever more important. Look at the informal employment. That's 93% of that is in developing and emerging nations. So we've still got to keep our eyes on that and making sure we work as partnerships to do that. Let's look at gender. It's another goal that we're always focused on. How do we work towards that? Well, 70% of the healthcare workers who are out there risking their lives, they're women. 60% of women's employment is informal and unprotected. And we've seen domestic violence going up by 25% in this crisis. So I think the bottom line is what we've always done and what we know we need to do, we have to keep our eyes on that prize. It's as important as it was before. So businesses, when they're looking at how to engage in this process with governments, I mean, I would say it's very much what we know works. It's just actually getting a lot harder. But what we've seen is huge amount of collaboration at the moment. I mean, it's a real privilege to see it. There are many, many initiatives and thousands of companies involved in activities that cover from response to the crisis today, recovery, building resilience going forward, and it is very much collaborative. And I mean, we've seen some of the examples before, but we're seeing it coming from mental health, supply chains, logistics, 3D printing, advanced manufacturing. So, I mean, organizations bringing their expertise to that on a partnership and a global scale is absolutely what we need to see. We know the pharma organizations are working together to crack solutions and working with the WHO. And also, again, coming back to the Sustainable Development Goals, we do see businesses not taking their eye off the longer term. If I take an example of Danone, they have 100,000 employees contract secured, income guaranteed till the end of June at least. Grants for employees who are working out in the field during the pandemic. Guaranteed healthcare, health, quarantine, childcare for all employees worldwide. And 15,000 small businesses with cash support, farmer suppliers, service providers. So again, that's an organization committed to climate development and therefore absolutely committed to labor principles, human rights principles. So it's taking the crisis right now, working together and making sure that in the future we come out better able to do that. The UN is working together to create a facility where businesses can come together. We can actually get the data from these countries, developing nations, working out what they're going to need, bring that together. Microsoft are going to do all the data and that analytics, and that will help us coordinate not just the crisis, but as has been mentioned, the socioeconomic issues that are going to face us afterwards. I actually am very, very encouraged to see all that activity, and I would say the more of this partnership and this, outcome-orientated, practical behaviour, the better.
That's great. Thank you so much. I know, Peter, you have to bounce for an important call at the UN. I'm curious if there's any closing comments. Just what do we need to see from the private sector in particular at this really important time to build partnerships?
Yeah, my apologies. Yeah, I have to jump off, but I think I came across a little too negative. I actually do agree that we have seen an enormous amount of creative and courageous partnerships happening. I suppose that my little bit of frustration is that I would like to have seen more of that before we had an absolute catastrophe on our hands. Does it take a catastrophe for us to get the level of partnership that we should? And I think we should learn something from what's happening now and about the power of the kinds of creative things that are happening, and sort of keep that for when we're through this, because otherwise we're missing something. We're missing some of the most powerful things that can happen in society. So that would be my comment. I am very sorry to have to pop off now.
Thanks,
okay,
Peter.
bye.
We appreciate you joining. No worries. Thank you. Neil, I'll throw to you, and then Michael, we're going to come to finish this section with you. Neil, you sit in such a fascinating spot. You're facing one of the larger public sector organizations in the world, but you bring them to the private sector and the private sector to them. So what are you seeing? What have you seen in terms of best practices that you would bring from the IFC to this moment in time? And what are you seeing right now that's really working? I'd be really curious to hear from you on that.
Thanks. So, our focus is on emerging markets, and there's no doubt we're just at the early stages of seeing the extent of the economic crisis that's going to hit emerging markets, and it's going to be a different challenge from what we have in the more developed countries, and that you have a much larger informal sector, you have weaker health systems, you have less of a social safety net, and also they're being hit by falling commodity prices. So we see a huge challenge both in the short term in terms of providing liquidity and support to enable firms to survive through the initial downturn and avoid a huge loss of jobs and loss of income. And what would be a huge setback for the Sustainable Development Goals, the growth of private enterprise and the way it's created jobs and provided services in emerging markets has really been central to the progress we've made in poverty reduction. And so we're very concerned to try and avoid that progress being reversed. And so our immediate focus is on working with our existing partner banks and firms that we work with to provide liquidity, to provide trade finance, provide working capital, to help firms be able to keep their employees on, to keep functioning, to keep providing services. And then secondly, I think we're already starting to think about how do we support a recovery from this downturn. I think something we've seen from previous economic shocks, whether it was the global financial crisis or earlier emerging market crisis, is that these shocks actually accelerate the process of structural change, that the economy doesn't grow back in the same shape it has before. And so that's actually an opportunity in order to help these economies grow back in a way which is more sustainable, which is more aligned with addressing climate change, which is more aligned with addressing inequality. So in order to get there, we're going to need rapid increase in the amount of financing, much more than what we or the rest of the World Bank Group can provide. And so a lot of what we're looking at now is how do we partner with private investors and really mobilize private finance in order to scale up the amount of financing in emerging markets. We think when the recovery phase comes, that these markets are still going to be long-term attractive for private investors. There's huge investment opportunities in investing in infrastructure and services that contribute to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So our focus is going to be on mobilizing more of that capital.
That's great, thank you. Michael, your day job is to work with investments and to think about infrastructure, and long-termism is something that I've heard from you for years now. I guess my question, this first section for you is, first, how is Guggenheim responding to this? How are you thinking about this? And then second, where do you think an organization like Goal 17 Partners needs to go to navigate these next 6 to 9 months?
So those are two very good but very distinct questions. In terms of Guggenheim, we manage money for pension funds, insurance companies, and sovereign wealth funds, and it is, and we are fiduciaries. So it is those pensioners who are, prospectively at greatest risk. So the thing that we can do is preserve their capital. So it's there to pay for a dignified retirement for the retirees and their families. Similarly, I believe that the property and casualty industry in particular is going to have an enormous challenge, does already have an enormous challenge on its hands. So Guggenheim and other asset managers have a small, but I think important role to play, and that is to preserve capital. Now, we're fortunate, I suppose, that we have been very conservative for almost 2 years, believing that no amount of cutting interest rates can forestall a recession. So we had believed that a recession was inevitable. So we had positioned our portfolios very conservatively. So our clients are in a very good position, thankfully. So I think what we now need to do is to seek out opportunity in the market. From the investor's perspective, that means things like buying hotels and buying in the real estate sector and elsewhere. And I want to be careful because, we could easily devolve into a conversation about people profiting from others' misfortune. But I think we should be mindful that those hotel employees need a place to go to work. So I think that companies like the one that I'm part of can do their part to get the economy moving again, because the restaurants eventually need to reopen. Those restaurateurs, but more importantly, the servers, the busboys, who frequently are at the low end of the economic ladder, need to return to work and provide for their families. So I think that's what we can do. And I think, Goal 17 is that in macrocosm, if that's a word. I think that, the private sector as a whole has a role to play. It's a little bit, in my mind, like a puzzle, and we each have certain puzzle pieces, and they're not necessarily identical. Guggenheim Partners must look for opportunity in the market, make capital available so that hotels can reopen and that restaurants can reopen and that airlines can get airborne again with the aircraft that they lease from us and from others. That's the role that we need to play. Other parts of the private sector need to play a much more prominent, and I would argue more important role, like our friends at Pfizer developing a vaccine and then making it widely available at cost or less than cost. So I really do think that when the chapter on this episode is written, we're going to see that some governments who have been telling their people for years that they no longer provide public goods, libraries, roads, and aircraft carriers, but instead they provide opportunity. I think that the people who elect them are going to find that maybe they weren't up to the task and that they want them to provide public goods. That's something for others to sort out. But I do think that when the chapter is written about this difficult episode, I think the private sector in a lot of ways has stepped up. And as to what Goal 17 Partners needs to do, I think we probably no longer need to be exclusively providing a safe harbor so that the private sector can talk about what it's doing on sustainability without too much criticism. I think maybe we need to lead with our chins a little bit more. And maybe, if anything, those of us who created Goal 17 Partners didn't have as much confidence in the rest of the private sector as perhaps we should.
That's great. Thank you, Michael. So there's a Q&A function for participants, which we've got over 100 participants. We'd love to hear your questions. One that came through that I'd love for each of you to respond to, and I'll call on you, but try to do it rapid fire because there's a few questions I'd love to get to. The first question is really specific, and it is, where have you seen, to use Michael's frame, where have you seen a partnership and in particular a company lead with their chin in your own personal experience? And I'll throw to Sue, you first, just very kind of rapid fire. Give me a great example of a private sector partnership that just was really dynamic from your experience.
Yeah, and I mentioned Danone. I also think Nestle joined up with the International Federation of Red Cross and the Red Crescent. So that's a really active partnerships, giving money straight away in. SAP have got an issue, I've called a thing called Open SAP. It's a education platform. They've put it out for everyone because people all around the world now needing to be educated at home. And yeah, there's plenty. I mean, so much, but there would be two that come to mind.
That's great. Asha, I'd be curious, what's a partnership that you've seen that's really worked and why?
I'm not sure if I would go for a specific example, but rather the ethos behind it to leverage a company's unique value add. And how do you utilize your technology? Because a lot of times, yes, we all put in funding, but at the same time, if you're able to use your company's unique, kind of like how Michael talked about Pfizer and leveraging that, but a lot of companies have really stepped up to be very innovative and creative in the space. And that, to me, what will resonate when the dust settles and when you look back at what companies and corporations have contributed to the crisis.
That's great. That's really smart. Not only money, but expertise, right? Because we do in fact have expertise in supply chains and these sorts of things. Neil, I'd be curious, what's an example of a partnership and a trait that we could apply to the people listening?
So let me mention a partnership which we've built over the last year to really help build the market for impact investing. And I think in this crisis, having investors who are focused on the environmental and social impact of their investments is going to be key to the kind of investments we need to see in the investor behavior during this crisis, which is going to focus on more than just protecting financial positions, but is going to look to protect the social and environmental impact of the firms they invest in. We've built a partnership of 93 investors over the last year who follow a common set of principles to invest for impact with discipline and report on a consistent basis, and that coalition manages over $300 billion in assets, and that's the coalition which I think is really going to step up in this crisis and make sure that private investment stays engaged and doesn't pull back from the areas where it can have the greatest impact.
That's great. Michael, what's an example of a partnership that you've seen, whether it be from Guggenheim or Goal 17?
So I guess I would make reference to the one I said at the outset. Some number of fashion houses are making seamstresses available to make masks. I mean, the sense we get from reading and watching popular culture is, these people could retire to their fabulous apartment and private island and sit this out. But the fact that they're in their ateliers, working with seamstresses making masks, I think is pretty impressive.
That's great. Tom, what's an example of a partnership you've seen that works?
So JR, our probably longest and maybe most impactful corporate partnership is with Walmart, the world's largest retailer. I actually have a team of 3 people that work for me that are based in Bentonville across the street from their home office, because we think the scale and the pace with which Walmart moves shapes the world in many ways. I'll give you 2 examples that I've been impressed with, although there are a lot of them. One is a project out of Bentonville, Arkansas, run by Walmart called Project Gigaton, which is part of their climate strategy, not only to reduce the emissions from their own operations, stores, distribution centers, fleets, but also to cut 1 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions from its supply chain. And if you're a retailer, 90+% of your climate footprint is in your supply chain. And another thing that Walmart has really led the industry on, creating a domino effect, was being an early leader in the retail sector and having an ambitious data-driven green chemistry policy. So basically using their purchasing power as a retailer to push known toxic chemicals out of the personal care and household cleaning and other products that we use every day. Because they're so big, they can move the industry, but they've also created a knock-on effect where other retailers, Target, CVS, Sephora, Dollar General, and others are following that lead.
That's great. Quick follow-on, Tom. There was a question in the Q&A. What kind of willingness do you think societies are going to have to invest into keeping societies and environments healthy, given this current crisis coming out of this? I'm just curious, what kind of trends do you think we could expect?
Well, you know, one that I'm excited about, Neil mentioned investors. January and February wasn't that long ago. At the start of this year, I thought it was the year for investor focus on climate and ESG. And I was hearing from the companies that we work with that investor pressure was becoming the driving force powering their low carbon transition strategies. You know, if you're going to work on solving big challenges like environmental challenges, you got to be optimistic. If I wear my optimistic hat, I can see a moment coming out of this where stakeholders like investors and employees and other stakeholders exert even more pressure on businesses to raise their ambition, think about their business models, and reshape them in ways that help solve big crises like climate and build more resilience and equity, you know, in the future of the world. It's the point Peter made before he signed off, which is, do we have to wait for the crisis to be here before we solve it? There is this parallel here with the climate crisis. We know it's coming, and many of the same leadership and institutions and strong science and those kinds of things are what we need to avert that crisis. Let's do it now as we come out of this, this global health challenge.
Yeah, I'd just like to build on one thing Tom was saying. I think you can actually, we've been seeing this grow and grow and grow, and you can see it live now. So Johnson & Johnson, obviously their share price drew, what, 6 percentage points as they announced the vaccination going into human trials in September. It's a not-for-profit delivery. It's a not-for-profit project. So that is saying that the investment community is looking to say we need to be on behalf of society, even if it isn't primarily day one profit making. Not that I'm against profit. I come from private sector, but we're seeing this happen. I have to say I'm optimistic about the same thing. The environment in which businesses are operating enables this. And it comes back to what you were saying, Michael, beforehand. I don't think it doesn't need to be a safe place. This is what's right for business going forward.
Great. Asha, you have a fascinating background in that you have global health experience and now you're focusing on resiliency. How do you see this question, and what do you think we're going to see coming out of this from the private sector and beyond?
I think crisis always leads to some form of innovation and innovative partnerships. And I think we saw that especially during the Ebola outbreak, where the private sector came together. And although it started off on a chaotic note of how do we respond effectively and leverage our resources, but I think eventually we got to a point of having more coordination and really even competitors talking to each other and really coming together during a disaster. And in this case, it's a healthcare disaster. So I strongly believe that post whenever we get through this pandemic, it's going to probably be at a much larger scale, and also looking across not just specific industries, but cross industries. So this isn't just a healthcare issue, but how do we really look at financing and also industrial companies, and how do we really bring all of those partnerships together, and where do we all fit within that puzzle? To Sue's point, I don't think this is necessarily distracting us from where we were going, because I think from Caterpillar's standpoint, we were focused on resiliency and disasters, and how do you really respond to some of those things. And this is really just taking that, and we're just on a fast track now with all of those partners. So my hope is that coming out of this, we don't lose sight of it, and know that this probably might not be the only crisis we're going to face in our lifetime. And if this is going to be part of our norm, how do we effectively use our leverage our resources effectively and build those partnerships? So that's where I hope that we come out of this and continue on.
Neil, how do you think we'll emerge? What do you think it looks like?
So I didn't quite catch your question.
What do you think we look like coming out of this? What happens to us?
So I agree with the optimists. I think that this crisis has shown that business doesn't operate in a vacuum. If you don't address basic needs of society, then business can't function. We've seen this in the most dramatic way possible in the current crisis. So I think you will see an increased focus on business, that they need to work in a broader context, and that they can contribute to creating that context. I think we've also seen that you can't always rely on government to do things, and that the partnership between the private sector and government is important in all countries. And so I think you're going to see businesses stepping up. I think I agree with Tom that even before the crisis, we saw increased pressure from the owners of capital, whether it's pension holders or other institutional investors, high net worth investors, increasing demand to make sure that their money was not just being invested for a financial return, but to have a positive impact. So I do think those trends are going to outlive this crisis. And I think what you're going to see, as well, as I say, is an acceleration of structural trends that were there before. One of the most important ones, I think, is going to be this, particularly in emerging markets, more activities going online. We're getting close to the point now in emerging markets, most people have the smartphone and access to broadband, which is kind of where we were 10 years ago. And this crisis has underlined the value of being able to take classes online, be able to talk to a doctor online, be able to do e-commerce, financial transactions online. So I think we'll see an acceleration of that trend. And lastly, I think we're already seeing a big increase in the use of artificial intelligence and leveraging big data in business across the world. I think, again, this crisis underlined the importance of really making great use of artificial intelligence, being able to track trends and analyze data in real time. I think that's going to be an important value addition for many businesses going forward as well.
That's great. Michael, I'm curious to hear you answer this question.
Well, I guess at the broadest possible level, I'm not terribly optimistic. I think that we as a group of societies are going to take a step backward. I don't know what that means necessarily, but I mean, if you look at past pandemics going back to the Black Plague in 1347, societies have really devolved as a consequence. Now, we have a lot of arrows in our quiver that we haven't had previously. I mean, we could have a vaccine, for example, in 18 or 24 months. So I think we're, at a societal level, we're going to take a step backward. I don't know what that means necessarily, but I do take Neil's point that the emerging markets, the lesser developed countries, are in the weakest position, such that if we all have to take a collective step back, they have the most to lose. I mean, it's true that they have smartphones and that they prospectively can do a lot of their banking that way, but in terms of the societal infrastructure, they're the ones who will need the most. So anyway, I don't mean to be such a pessimist necessarily, but I think that if we are going to take a collective step backwards, whatever that means, those of us who have the tools, whether it's the Pfizers of the world who might create the vaccine and then make it available for free in the lesser developed countries, I think we are going to be called upon to do more. I don't know precisely what that looks like, but yeah. So I mean, the pessimist in the room says we're going to take a collective step back, but I suppose I believe that will create an opportunity for us to do more.
Great. That actually leads me to my last question. I know we've gone over time, and we've still got over 100 observers and participants. So thank you for sticking around. So I'm going to ask one last question and ask you to answer quickly because we are over time, and I want to throw to Susan and give her a chance to talk about what's coming next from Goal 17. C.S. Lewis has a great quote that says, "Courage is every virtue at its testing point." Peter began this call by talking about the need for personal leadership. Michael, you just talked about the fact that we're going to need to do more. I'm curious, what's one virtue that we need to see from executive leaders around the world as we emerge from this crisis to build more partnerships? One virtue. Asha, you're up first.
I would say we need to be more nimble. We need to give up control and collaborate, and not just talk about it, but collaborate and figure out how we can build.
I love it. That's great.
Better.
That's great. Neil, one virtue.
Patience. We're found as an investor, if you're willing to stick with good companies and take a long-term view, that you can ride out these crises. So be patient, everybody.
That's great. Sue?
I would say humble. It's not going to be easy. We're going to have to be a bit, stick together, be a bit humble, but we'll get through if we lock hands in that way.
Agreed. Tom?
People are taking all the good ones. I'm going to go bravery, JR, and say that we need to be brave in continuing to march down the path that takes us from shareholder primacy to stakeholder capitalism.
That's great. Michael?
I would say empathy, because those who've demonstrated empathy are those that we find ourselves tuning into, listening to, following.
That's good. That's good. Well, thanks to all of our panelists. I believe we are witnessing the rise of something we're calling at Goal 17 and Handshake, the rise of the impact executive. And we believe this impact executive will be a virtuous leader. And I think all of the virtues that you've pointed to are exactly the kind that we're looking to cultivate through these conversations. I now want to throw it to my good partner and just a tremendous leader, Susan Myers, to kind of talk about Goal 17 and wrap us up and give us some next steps. And again, thank you to the panelists.
Thank you very much, JR. It's been a real pleasure to partner with you and Michael and Rob and others of you in building out the vision of Goal 17 Partners. This is the culmination of a series of 4 virtual roundtables this week. For those of you who tuned in today and liked what you heard, I encourage you to visit the goal17partners.org website. There will be recordings of our other 3 sessions in addition to this one posted on that site. They're probably already there for the other 3 sessions. And this is part of what we see as a series of virtual roundtables over the coming months and probably in the future beyond that, since we do have this efficient new way of doing business. And we want to do these in partnership with all of you. We see some great opportunities to do so in the next couple of months. And we also will be rolling out a series of virtual design labs. And these will be opportunities to workshop business solutions around some aspects of the sustainable development agenda where companies are struggling with some of the same issues and want to step up and do more. These will, of course, also happen in the context of everything happening now. And since this is the culmination of the series and we had a couple of other quotes referenced, I wanted to refer back to something I heard one of my favorite people I've had the opportunity to work with, Amina Mohammed, say on the kickoff call that the UN Global Compact has actually been convening over the next several weeks. She said to the first call they had, which I think involved 3,000 people from around the world, that this current crisis is maybe God putting the world on pause so we do a better job at listening to the issues that young people have been calling our attention to in recent years. And I, whether you're religious or not, I reacted to that saying, I hope that that's the case. And especially since the issue of listening better was brought up, I wanted to refer to that. It gave me some comfort and inspiration, and I hope it does for all of you as well. So thank you for the panel, for the great discussion, and for all of you who've tuned into these sessions, and we look forward to working with you in the future.